Hey Stormtroopers, Mitch Blankensport here from MTGModernStorm.com. Thought I would go through and talk about the deck list I've been just trying out earlier in this new format, and a pretty crazy match I had against Blue-White Control the other night. I posted on Twitter. Still working on getting my OBS situated, so I'm looking in a couple different places. I apologize. Got to get an external webcam so I can look up. The deck list you see in front of you, this is sort of my first take on Storm in a relatively unknown metagame. Disclaimer, I took about a 10-month hiatus from playing Magic, so I'm getting back in the swing of things and going to make mistakes, and this is very early in the format. Just wanted to talk about a couple of my card choices. So the lands, we can go back and forth about fetch lands, non-fetch lands, mana base, etc. This is my preferred as of now. I like the 4 Scalding Tarn because you can fetch both Basic Mountain and Basic Island. I'm playing 17 lands because I'm playing the full suite of 12 cantrips, 1 mana cantrips rather. If you're going to play like Sleight of Vision and cards like that, you may want to play 18 lands, then you're going to play only 8 cantrips. There have been some people that have had some success with that. I personally like to play my Storm decks with at least 10 1-mana cantrips because I feel like the deck gets kind of clunky at times, and when you're playing less than 10 cantrips, in my opinion. So there's that. We're playing 3 Grapeshot and only 2 Remands. Most people have that flipped around. The format thus far for me has felt pretty fast, so I really like playing just a single copy of, or sorry, just 2 copies of Remand, not playing the full 3, and the whole double Grapeshot line is very real. I'm trying out 2 Birgi, as you can see right here. I think this card is interesting. It's generated a lot of talk in the Storm community. Obviously, it's 3 mana, which has negative consequences against Goblin Electromancer being 2 mana. The effect is not the same, but the Horn has been pretty good for me thus far in my testing. Obviously, against Blue-White, very slow, grindy matchup. It can be pretty solid. And you'll see in Game 3, the reason why we win is because of that card. 2 Past in Flames, pretty standard. The 4 copies of Gifts Ungiven, doing 8 mana bears. If you count Birgi or Birgi, however you say that, I'll probably float between the 2, because those are your enablers that you need to win. The sideboard really is a mosh pit right now. I would not put too much stock into the sideboard. The one card, like this card, is just kind of a favorite of mine. It's pretty slow and clunky, but it's an extra grindy card. I really like Mystical Dispute. I think it's probably the best counter that Storm can play in its sideboard. The 1 copy of Negate, that could be Spell Pierce, that could be Dispel, that could be a lot of other things. Dispel for me has been a little bit too narrow in the past, so I've just been playing the 1 Negate. The one thing, and obviously you have the 1 Abrade, the couple of bolts, this Flame Slash could be a Dismember. Again, I'm really early in my testing process with this format, so don't get caught up too much in that. The one thing I did want to touch on, though, is the 3 copies of Aria of Flame and the 1 copy of Empty the Warrens. I've really, really liked 3 Aria of Flame. You'll see it in this matchup as well. And I feel pretty good about where I'm at with that split. I would not play less than 3 Aria of Flame. Some people do a 2-2 split here, and that's not what I'd like to do. Also, one thing I should have mentioned in the discussion about the main deck here is I'm not playing a bounce spell in the main deck. A lot of people play Repeal because it cantrips. My stance right now, new in a format, I post this on Twitter, follow us at Storm Modern if you haven't, is to be as streamlined as you can Game 1 and accept losing to cards like Meddling Mage naming Grapeshot or something pre-board that you're not expecting. Just my stance. I understand why people play Repeal, perfectly reasonable, but that's what I'm doing. Also, I'd like to shout out, if you can see, I'm wearing my, over here, the epicstorm.com. Thanks to Bryant Cook for having me on for League last week. Generated quite a bit of traction. I think there's some talk about us continuing to do that. For those of you who don't know, I'm also the editor of that site. So really enjoyed having him on. This list is sort of a derivative from his, with my own kind of spin on it. So that's the deck list. Again, don't get too caught up in the sideboard. It's kind of a mosh, but I think the important things to note are I'm playing 12 1-mana cantrips. I'm playing 3 Grapeshots main deck. I'm playing 2 Birgi because I don't think I have enough data on the card to make educated decision on whether to play or not. The Horn has felt pretty good to me, so I don't see, maybe I see myself trimming down to 1 copy in the main deck at some point in time, but I think I'm going to play at least 1 in the main for the time being. And then in the sideboard, really it's the 3 Aria of Flame and 1 Empty the Warrens rather than the 2/2 split. So there is the deck that I'm playing, and we'll get into these matches here. We had a 3-round set against a pretty solid opponent. Again, forgive my OBS, still getting used to that. But here is the sideboard. I'll try to ping that up for you here. There we go. So, playing, won the die roll. I liked this hand. I thought it was fine. I'm going to lead on Scalding Tarn and get an island and just cast Sleight of Hand here. Sorry, I'm still working on these controls. The 2 cards were Mountain and Baral because I have 1 Baral already and I need my 3rd land. I think it's pretty easy to take the land. So I see Flooded Strand pass, which immediately I think blue-white controls some kind of control deck. Could be Esper, could be Stoneblade, could be a bunch of other things. But I'm going to jam Baral into this. And I was pretty surprised my opponent actually did cast Path to Exile here. Which I'm like, okay, great. That's wonderful. And then here is an interesting decision that I wonder if I made a mistake. I could have tried to go, Electromancer, Rit, Gifts, and that wins the game if my opponent has no interaction. I figured with 2 mana, given that they pathed my Bear there on their turn 1, I kind of figured they had some interaction. So I didn't cast it. Opponent just plays land go. So I decide not to cast Gifts here. And I think that might be a mistake because, again, if I cast Gifts and they counter it with Archmage's Charm or something else, I have a untapped Goblin Electromancer, Rit, Pass and Flames, then I have enough to kill with a blue mana up to cast Gifts again. So maybe a little bit of mistake on my part for not going for it here. But I didn't. Ritual is not the best draw. Our opponent plays draw, going, this time I decide to go for it, and this gets met with Archmage's Charm, which would have maybe happened last turn unless they drew it. So here, now I draw another Ritual, and my opponent has 1 mana up. Obviously, they're a blue deck. Obviously, they play Force and Negation. I was aware of that here, but I looked at my hand. I doesn't draw any mana at all, and I kind of figured if this game goes long, I'm not in a great position given the way that my hand is set up. So I do decide to go for it here. And you'll see here I get met by a Force and Negation, and that effectively ends the game. We might have... Oh, here we go. Yep. So Force and Negation happened. I think we go on for maybe another turn or 2, but I think I end up conceding here because I just don't have anything going on. I think our opponent plays big Teferi here, and that pretty much wraps the game up. Was I wrong to go for it there? I don't know. I don't claim to be an expert with Storm. It's just a deck I enjoy playing, and I've played with it a decent amount. So I thought I'd make this website and have a community hub for the Storm archetype. But feel free to mention in the comments if you think that I should have gone for it there and I didn't. Or sorry, if I shouldn't have gone for it there when I did. I don't know. But the draws didn't line up here, and I'm gonna I end up scooping here pretty quick to Fairy. So game 2, we will pull up right here. So sideboarding, I sided in 3 Aria of Flame, 1 Empty the Warrens, 2 Mystical Dispute, a Fact or Fiction, and a Negate. And I took out a copy of Past in Flames, a Pyretic Ritual, a Desperate Ritual, 1 Gifts Ungiven because I'm bringing in the Fact or Fiction, and 1 copy of each ritual. Now, I'm not sure if that's... also 4 Sleight of Hand, which I'll get to that in a second. I wonder if I shouldn't board that heavily and leave in at least 2 copies of Sleight of Hand. Again, my personal preference is to play with 10 1-mana cantrips, so your draws get smoothed out and you find some things that you need. But it's what I end up doing, and I do like the cards I brought in. I think they're all pretty good in this matchup. So choose to play first. I have a very good hand here. Cantrip on turn 1, have Remand on turn 2, I have Dispute as interaction, I also have Aria of Flame. So think I bleed on Steam Vents here. Obviously, you don't want to play the Fiery Islet or Islet, however you say that, right away. So I see Birgi and Aria of Flame, and I drew my third land. So this is great. I don't remember what I did with the Birgi, but I definitely put the Aria of Flame on top, and I'll tell you why. So my opponent just goes land pass here, and I draw Aria of Flame. So in this spot here, I think you could hold up Remand, but I don't think there's any turn 2 play that really scares me. I mean, you're going to see the opponent does play Rest in Peace, but my hand's not set up to where Rest in Peace matters that much anyways. So I decide to play Ritual, and then thinking I'm going to go into Aria of Flame. If the opponent counters it, I'm going to play Aria of Flame again and go from there. The opponent could have Spell Snare, they could have Spell Pierce, they could have Dispel, they could have a number of things. But my thought was, if you play Ritual, there's an off chance the opponent might think I'm going for like a quick Empty the Warrens, like Writ, Empty the Warrens. So I decide to cast Ritual. My opponent does cast Opt here. Or they don't. They think about it. They cast Opt after Aria of Flame. I'm assuming they're looking for Force and Negation here. So opponent casts Opt, and they let Aria of Flame resolve. So that kind of told me that they probably don't have Force and Negation in their hand at this point, because they certainly would have cast it, I think. So they played Rest in Peace here. Again, saw some discussion on Twitter about this card. I think it's good enough to bring in if you're blue-white, but we board in a way for a Storm deck that we try to make Rest in Peace not as relevant by boarding out that one copy of Past in Flames, as you see below my head. So, interesting decision here. I decide to pass. Now, I can totally see the argument for playing a second Aria Flame. In fact, maybe that might have been correct, assuming that we go off the premise that they don't have Force and Negation. I also could play Birgi, but my thought was, I have Counter Magic in hand. Let's just try to hold that up, because they're going to have to answer the Aria Flame. And we end up playing Draw Go here for a while. So one of the things I love about Aria Flame in this matchup, more so than Empty the Warrens, is it forces your opponent, a blue-white deck that did not show me any creatures other than Snapcaster Mage, to play a very proactive game, because they're going to die to the Aria, and that's not something the deck does very well. So again, I'm content to just play Draw Go here. I'm missing some lands, so maybe that's a reason for me to fire some off. My opponent does Shock here, which I thought was interesting. I was expecting like some kind of 3-mana play with counter backup. So I drew a land, thankfully. I could certainly see an argument for casting Desperate Ritual into Gifts Ungiven, but I kind of wanted to leave up Mystical Dispute for some kind of counterspell. So now I'm definitely going to cast Gifts Ungiven at the end step here, because I have 7 cards. And if my opponent counters it, I have some untapped things that I can do. So my opponent fetches. They're going to have a first action here, so they play Time Raveler. Interesting card, obviously something that is going to be able to bounce Aria Flame. You'll see in Game 3 in this matchup that happens quite a bit. So I think here for the while, I'm going to cast Morphos first, which, again, if this is incorrect, could be the case. But my thought was I want to hit lands. And my opponent's likely not going to counter it, so I have no issue casting Manamorphose there. I believe I go for Remand, because so because I drew Op, here's my plan. If my opponent ends up countering Remand, and then I Mystical Dispute, and then they counter Dispute, or they end up playing Time Raveler again, I dispute it, and they dispute back, or whatever happens, Raveler bounces Aria Flame. I get to untap, play Aria Flame, and then Opt, and then shoot the Raveler and kill it. And we're in kind of the same situation. So my opponent ends up not casting again. And here, I believe I end up making what I think is a pretty big mistake. So I cast the first Opt here. And Empty the Warrens, great card, going to top that. And what I should have done here is I should have held up Mystical Dispute. In my mind, for some reason, I was thinking like they had Celestial Purge. And this is a very loose play on my part, because what happens here, the opponent ends up punishing me for it. And they end up casting Cryptic Command to bounce my Aria Flame and draw a card. So again, we're getting our opponent to tap out on their turn, which is good, but now I have to pay 3 more mana towards Aria Flame, so not the best. There, I definitely should not have opted. I should have been disciplined and waited. Definitely going to bottom that other Birgi, because I already have a copy. But again, this game has been kind of about Aria Flame, not about Birgi at this point, so I'm going to cast Ritual. and opt, and I'm actually going to go for Empty the Warrens here instead of Aria of Flame, which again, if somebody thinks that's wrong, please tell me. I thought it was a really interesting decision. This is kind of why, because I figured my opponent was going to have some kind of big play, and I wanted to sort of give them the Supreme Verdict test. This Empty the Warrens is, other than a card like Detention Sphere or Supreme Verdict, is much better because it's harder for Planeswalkers to answer than as Aria of Flame just as a single card. So Teferi resolves, and here comes the other Teferi, and I'm honestly not sure why I didn't dispute there. I think that would have been the time to do it, and I didn't, but my thought again was, I guess here, this game to me is still about Aria of Flame. They were playing a sub game with Empty the Warrens. Our opponent's going to get 2 untapped lands with the Hero of Dominaria, but my thought is I'm just going to be able to kill these walkers with Goblin tokens, and I guess it time walks. It delays their death by a turn, but I thought this was the better play. So I end up going all of them at the Planeswalkers because if my opponent has something, then I want to make sure to kill it with Aria of Flame. So that interaction there was, I cast Aria of Flame, which some people might say, why would you do that? Because you're giving them 10 life. Because again, to me, at this point in the game, the Goblin tokens are a sub-game. You hear, if any of you, I'm sure a lot of you will watch Caleb Shearer's stream Storm. He's a very good player, and he talks about Empty the Warrens creating a sub-game in this kind of matchup, and that's what I was doing. This game, to me, has still been about Aria of Flame, but now I'm attacking him on 2 different axes. The opponent casts Mana Leak, and I Mystical Dispute to get Aria of Flame on the battlefield. And our opponent just scoops it up here. So that was game 2. I thought it went pretty well. I had some good draws for sure. And then game 3. This is where it gets really pretty nutso. I make a boatload of mistakes in this game because it's such a long game. I did not sideboard any different on the player on the draw. This hand is missing a second land, but we're on the draw with an op, so I'm going to keep it. And I do a second land right there. Going to do some cantripping here, both of us. And I opt, and I see a Morphose, which I believe I keep because that card is great. Another land is great. Definitely what we want to see. So obviously if my opponent goes, I don't think they'll do this, but if my opponent goes Time Raveler here, I'm remanding 100%. I think that's really loose of the opponent to try to do that. Into 2 open mana, and this player is a pretty good player in at least my estimation. So again, I'm not going to play Electromancer here. There really isn't a need to. I think sometimes some Storm players against control decks, they get kind of freaked out like, oh, we've got to go, which I guess you can fault me for potentially doing that in the first game, the pre-board game. But I don't think there's a reason to here. We're not, yes, we need to draw lands, and if we miss a land, we may have to do something, but I didn't think it was correct to do that into 3 open mana. Our opponent casts Field of Ruin. We're playing 5 basics, 2 snow-covered islands, 2 regular islands, and a mountain. So I'm definitely going to prioritize fetching Steam Vents here. I didn't fetch because I want to draw a land, and this is some play that I don't know. It's really hard to measure the utility of this kind of play, but I shocked here to bluff Gifts Ungiven. I don't think the life is relevant in this matchup. My opponent has not shown me hardly any creatures in 2 games, so I wasn't scared of getting beaten down by like a Brazen Borrower, Vendilion Click, Spell Queller, something like that. My life total I don't think is that relevant, and I just wanted to bluff having Gifts Ungiven and make my opponent think about it. Again, feel free in the comments. If you think that's incorrect, please let me know. Still not going for it here. Don't have a reason to. And I'm not going to fetch because I don't mind drawing lands. So now you see me play Electromancer. Why? Because I'm going to have to discard. And I don't really want to discard here. So I'm going to play Electromancer. And then Amorphose just kind of testing the waters. Our opponent pass. I have 0 issue with getting pathed here. And then our opponent actually spell snares the Morphose. So here's an example of I don't know what I would have done with that mana. Maybe tried to play Birgi, but I don't think so. I think I just would have passed. So we kind of got one of the opponent's best cards in their deck against a Spell Snare out of their hand here. I was pretty happy about that. And then they surgical extraction Manamorphose. Sorry, off on the controls there for a minute. Let me try to pause. So they surgical extraction Manamorphose, which I thought was a little bit odd of them. Definitely something to worry about with like Snapcast or Surgical Grapeshot at some point. Yeah, but I just thought that was a little bit an odd play for their part, so I'm fine. Then they cast Teferi Time Raveler. Now here's a spot where I decide that I'm going to dispute. Here and again, my point was I wanted to tap them out. Excuse me, and then untap and potentially play the Horn or something else, even though Teferi would be able to move the Horn. I have Grapeshot to tick it down. So there were some options for me. And here my opponent makes a pretty bad misplay. They use Archmage's Charm when they could have just paid for Dispute. And I was kind of like, okay, like, sure. You can use a card out of your hand for really no reason. So Time Raveler is obviously a problem. My Remand is now worthless. I can't do cool tricks with rituals, things like that. This was a very good draw, though. I got bailed out. This was, I would say, I mean, my opponent's only on one card, as you see, but depending on what that card is, if Teferi stays in the battlefield for too long and my opponent gets to fuel up their hand with counterspells or other things like that, this was pretty lucky in my part, but a draw that was very good. And I'm going to definitely go ahead and cast Aria of Flame here. And then I end up ritualing and then Grapeshotting to kill the Raveler, with both Aria of Flame triggers. So now we're basically at parity here. Our opponent is up on us one land, but we're up on them a card, and we have Aria of Flame in play. So I'm feeling pretty good about our spot at this point. Our opponent draws land. So here I decide to go for the Horn. Now, you may seem like this is a pretty aggressive play, and why would you go for this? You have Remand, you can wait to set it up. So my thought was that Remand really is only gonna stop like a Cryptic command, and our opponent's one land away from being able to like recast Cryptic, and they only have one card in hand. So I think sometimes Storm players, I'm guilty of it at times too, can just want to play around absolutely everything. And I think they only had one card in hand here, and I talked about in game 2 about wanting to diversify your threats and make our opponent answer two different things. And so that's why I decided to jam here. And it worked out. So our opponent, again, they Cryptic command on their main phase, bouncing Aria of Flame, which that's going to be a trend you're going to see in this match for sure. So I decide to use the Horn, discarding Spirebluff Canal. I do, and if you can see, I'll move this over here for you. Pyretic Ritual and Gifts Ungiven are the two cards. So what I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to cast Aria of Flame again, which I have Remand back up here. And I thought, so this is the interesting thing about the Horn, is the cards get exiled if you don't use them. So I decide that I'm going to cast the two cards, which does tap me out at this point. But again, my opponent only has two cards. Aria of Flame triggers going on the stack here. This is an interesting gift spot. I think our opponent ends up countering it, which I'm totally fine with. Doesn't really matter. What would have I gotten there? Probably, honestly, a string of cantrips. I think would have been like Serum Visions, Manamorphose, and then maybe even another Gifts Ungiven. Could be a counterspell, although I don't like. Our opponent's not likely to give us a counterspell, and our counterspells, other than the one of Negate, are just kind of soft permission. So our opponent there casts Archmage's Charm to draw two cards. And I think we see a big Teferi here. And interesting, I thought this was an interesting play on our opponent's part. I would have expected them to use the A2 here and bounce one of our two cards, but our opponent doesn't do that. So the read I had at the time was that our opponent has something to do with this 2 mana. That was my read. So I end up cracking the Islet here for Serum Visions. Cast Serum Visions, and obviously I'm going to ping the Teferi. And we end up drawing some pretty good cards here. Excuse me while I hydrate. Definitely the Negate is very good. I'm going to put that on top. And I'm going to cast the Ritual here and again, this does tap me out, but I think it's more important to get the Teferi Hero of Dominaria off the field. I could have cast Baral there, but I decided not to. And just pass. Alternatively, I could use the Horn, discarding Baral that turn, but we only have 1 mana left. Our opponent plays Jace. Now, the interesting thing here, they're going to Brainstorm. And then Aether Gust our Aria of Flame, which I decided to put on top, and they play Rest in Peace, which again, we've sided for. This game is not about Past in Flames right now. So I just get Aria of Flame on the battlefield, and I'm going to hold up my Remand. And now the interesting thing is, so our opponent Fate Seals, and then leaves Negate on the top of our deck, which I thought was a pretty odd decision. From our opponent there, I would expect them to bottom that. Not sure why they took that line. So I use the Horn, discarding Baral, which you may think is like crazy, but at this point I just want cantrips. I want that Aria Flame to move the sideboard a little bit less so we can see there's no counters on Aria Flame right now. I want that thing to be churned up. Our opponent's at 41 now because we've played Aria Flame a couple times. I don't think this game is about Baral right now. The Horn revealed 2 lands. I play the Spirebluff Canal, tap and pass. So our opponent's Fate Sealing here, which again, at this point, I don't think that's correct from our opponent because eventually the Aria Flame is going to ping down the Jace. So I'm not sure what they were thinking about when they were doing this, but that was their play. And I end up binning a land and getting Electromancer and Past in Flames. I'm just going to play the Electromancer. I don't think it's right here to play Past in Flames just for an Aria Flame trigger. I mean, obviously Rest in Peace is in play. I'd rather hold up Negate and Remand. Our opponent casts Path, which I let happen. Again, this game is not about bears at this point. So our opponent continues to Fate Seal. And we draw a land, so I'm going to use the Horn and put Baral in Serum Visions. I'm going to cast Serum Visions, and I'm going to start hitting the Jace the Mind Sculptor. I make a pretty big mistake here. I'm definitely keeping the Opt and bottoming the Serum Vision, or bottoming the Scalding Tarn. I think the mistake's a little bit later. So I just play Baral and pass. I don't feel the need to opt right now. Our opponent's going to Brainstorm. Now of note, they did play Colonnade. So now they have a clock. We're at 14. I'm not feeling in danger of that, of losing to that quite yet, but it's something to keep in mind. So Narset Parter of Veils. I do decide to Remand here only because I want to start hitting the Jace, and I want a cantrip. I now have Baral in play, so I get a loot from that, and I'm okay with our opponent tapping lower if they want to replay Narset. Also shuts our opt off here. So I'm, again, could be the wrong play here on my part, but I decide to do it. And I do end up looting, and I discard Birgi because we have the Horn in play already. And for those of you who don't know, the Horn is legendary. So they play Narset again, and I'm going to opt this time. And I see Aria Flame. I'm going to keep it. I don't opt a second time, which I could have. So Narset reveals Supreme Verdict. So I'm going to play the second Aria Flame here. Now again, I could be incorrect here, but I'm giving our opponent a ton of life. I mean, they're at 51, and there's one thing I'll tell you about in a second here that I wasn't really thinking about quite yet, which is a punt on my part. Be curious again in the comments if you think it was right or wrong to play Aria Flame, but I decide to because now they have 2 walkers on the field, and I kind of want to get them off. So my priority first here is to get rid of the Narset because that's preventing me from drawing more cards. So I believe I top for sure the Gifts Ungiven. I think I bottom the Baral, and we finish off the Jace here. I'm going to draw this Gifts Ungiven, and I'm going to pass the turn. Or get in for 1, excuse me. Our opponent casts Time Raveler. Now, maybe it's wrong of me to burn my Negate here because I don't know if this game is really about Time Raveler. So I think if they resolve Time Raveler, I think they probably bounce the Horn, but they could bounce the Aria of Flame that has more counters on it. So the reason why I negate here is because if I don't end up killing the Raveler, if they bounce an Aria and then like have another like Cryptic Command or something else, and then I don't have anything at instant speed, that was my thought. So again, this could be an aggressive use of negate. Our opponent does use Mana Leak, and they do get a use off of Mana Leak this late in the game, which is maybe a mistake on my part. So opponent puts the Aria of Flame in my hand that has more counters. So now one thing I'm thinking about here is, if you notice, I only have 16 cards left in my deck. There's a lot of my cantrips are gone, which I talked about in the sideboarding. Maybe I'm supposed to leave in more Sleight of Hands. With the Horn and with Aria of Flame, the 1-mana cantrips are just so strong. I have not played a lot with Scalding Vision, but I don't like Scalding Vision with the Horn because you want to be as mana efficient as possible. And I get the bimodal focus on Scalding Vision. I'm not saying the card itself is not good. I just haven't liked it in this shell, the small sample size of matches that I played. So here's where I use the Horn, get rid of a land, and I try to attack first here because I want to use the Aria of Flame at the face. And our opponent Cryptic Commands, returning it to hand. Here's where I make a mistake. I just play the Baral again for my hand. Obviously, there's one sitting right here. Like, duh. Should definitely play that one because that's going to get exiled. So I just lost myself a card with that exchange. So I play the Ritual here to get rid of the Teferi Time Raveler. Maybe I'm supposed to play the other Aria of Flame first. So that's a mistake on my part because that could have gotten a little more value. Our opponent casts Force and Negation here on our second Aria of Flame. And now I cast Gifts Ungiven. So remember, if I didn't know my opponent had Supreme Verdict, which maybe they exiled to force Negation. No, they exiled Dovin's Veto. So I know one of the cards they have in their hand is Supreme Verdict. So that's why I don't use Empty the Warrens. Otherwise, I would almost 100% jam Empty the Warrens here because, again, diversity of threats against blue-white is very important. So here's my deck left. Like, not a lot going on. I end up getting the Serum Visions, the Opt, and then the Ritual. So the Ritual is an interesting one. I think I probably made a mistake with a Dispute. I probably should have gotten another, like, the Factor Fiction or the Gifts Ungiven, but really, like, I've got 10 cards in my deck, right? Like, I'm not worried about... I just need to trigger Aria of Flame. I'm not worried about losing to not having enough cards with a Horn as well. So our opponent gives us these, and I don't go Ritual Empty again because I know about Supreme Verdict. The Dispute is more just insurance, but again, it seems like an odd... I wanted something that I could play this turn, but it seems like an odd get to me given how much mana they have. So our opponent, I believe, activates Colonnade here. So they're at 3:15 or so on their clock. So they have to die. So I know that I'm basically on with a blue-white deck, they're not going to have a lot of reach. So I'm basically on a 3-turn clock here. I do use Steam Vents to exile to the Horn. I'm only at 7 cards again. So I cast Ritual here, trigger Aria of Flame. And I thought about using the Horn, but then I think I sat and I did some calculations, and this ends up being lethal, I believe, with the Grapeshot and the Aria of Flame triggers. I could have also disputed my own spell, which here, if I needed the correct play here, if my opponent has more life, if I want to go all in, now they have 3 cards in hand, 1 of Supreme Verdict, and 4 mana up. I could, in theory, like Mystical Dispute just to get another Aria of Flame trigger if I had to. But that ends up being the kill, and that's the game. So I end up beating blue-white. And I'm 2-1 now in this league. So hey, wrapping up here. Thanks for watching. Again, feel free to post in the comments. I'll probably post this on Twitter at some point. Really, really interesting game, and I'm sure I made some mistakes in that match, particularly games 2 and 3. I thought they went pretty long, and there were some really interesting decisions, especially in game 3. Again, this is Mitch Blankenspore from MTG Modern Storm. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back sometime.